Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here today for our conference focused on LGBTQ people and LGBTQ rights here in California and in Los Angeles. I'm really excited to moderate this panel today of good friends and excellent people and true experts in this area. One of our panelists might be arriving a little later, but we'll get started to make sure we end on time and can get to the reception with the wine and cheese afterwards. Again, welcome everyone. I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves because they know themselves and their work much better than I do. So I would like to start with Naomi Goldberg.
Hi, everybody. My name is Naomi Goldberg. I use she, her pronouns. I am the executive director at the Movement Advancement Project. But in 2008, I was a public policy fellow at the Williams Institute. So it's really wonderful to be back with you all.
Thank you. And Amanda Goad.
Is this on?
Yes.
Hallelujah. I'm Amanda Goad. I use she, her, or zir. I'm a senior staff attorney at the ACLU of Southern California here in Los Angeles, and I'm also co-lead of the team working on gender, sexuality, and reproductive justice issues for the ACLUs of California.
And Kevin Goodman.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Kevin Goodman. I am the assistant director and current acting director of the LGBTQ Center here at UCLA. Hi to those that don't know that are here. My background is in social organizational psychology and gender studies and communications. And I believe
Our panelist
panelist is
has arrived. Yeah, should be.
May I have a minute?
Is that better sounding?
Way.
Apologies, everybody. I got
Oh, we just started 1 second ago. So you're right, actually on time. So this is Reverend Benita Ramsey, and I would like her to introduce herself to all of you.
Hi, my name is Reverend Benita Ramsey. I am the pastor of Unity Fellowship Church Riverside, but also the executive director of Rainbow Pride Youth Alliance and the board president for the Minority AIDS Project.
Great. So thank you, everyone. We are going to start with Naomi, who I think has a few slides to show us. But Naomi, I know the Movement Advancement Project tracks tons of policies across the country, kind of at the state level, federal level, local level, including policies that impact LGBTQ students. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what the national policy landscape looks like for LGBTQ students and kind of maybe what kind of trends and changes we're seeing in this area.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Christy. Great getting my slides up. Just to start, I think it's really important to note, that where policy comes from is a lot of places. And so we can't necessarily think about the lives of LGBTQ students without thinking about these layers of policy. So, obviously we have the federal level that may come through laws passed by Congress or court cases. And most specifically for youth in schools, we have to think about Title IX, which many of us think about as sort of allowing women to play sports in the 1970s, but it provides really important protections based on sex that have been interpreted to be protective of LGBTQ students. And then obviously we have state level laws and policies that may come through the legislature, but also through courts and state agencies. And then, we have city and county ordinances that often do impact what happens in schools. And then, you have local school boards, and then, you have your individual school. And I can say as a parent of a 10-year-old, what happens at my kid's school is different than what happens to the school across the street or down the block, even though we're in the same district and the same city and the same state. So just to kind of ground us in like where do policies that come from that impact for students, I think it's important. So we at MAP do track a lot of laws and policies, and I think, just to start with, like, what are these foundational pieces? For a long time, the movement, and advocates worked to sort of shore up what we think of as this foundation of protections for our students. So primarily non-discrimination laws. And so you can see here across the country, where we have protective laws in that dark green. And while obviously our panel today is focused on California, so keep an eye on California and how it changes colors as I go through my slides. It is really helpful to see what's happening across the country. And as we're going to hear from others, what is happening across the country is also happening here, just at at different levels. So you can see here we have 20-ish states that do have some good protection for LGBTQ students through state law. And then we have a couple of states, I think interestingly in the orange, that have actually kind of preempted protections to say, you can't do more than what we have at the state level. The other kind of foundational piece that, we as a movement have worked on for probably 25 or 30 years in the school space is anti-bullying. And a lot of research done by Glisten, researchers at Williams and others have found that enumerated laws, both non-discrimination and anti-bullying laws, when they actually say sexual orientation, they actually say gender identity, not just you can't bully, that those are they're more protective for LGBTQ students and actually more protective for all students. That when there are enumerated anti-bullying and non-discrimination laws for students, it impacts outcomes for all students, regardless of whether they are LGBTQ themselves or not. So a similar map to the non-discrimination map that we saw earlier. These are the anti-bullying laws. And I think particularly given what we know is happening around discussions of LGBTQ topics in schools, I think the states that have the star are very interesting. They prohibit bullying based on association. So if you have a queer parent, my son could not be bullied in the state I live in because I'm gay, but he couldn't be bullied because he has a gay parent. And so I think that's an interesting kind of association language in some of these laws. So now I'm going to get into kind of where things are moving and hot topics, I like to call them. So what is old is new again when it comes to battles over curriculum. And I think particularly for many of us in this room, we need to think back to the late 80s and early 90s when we saw many states, 6 in total at one point, but 4 currently have really kind of what we call outdated, old school curriculum censorship bills. And these were what we sometimes call no homo promo, right? Where you can't talk about homosexuality. These all came through the AIDS epidemic and schools trying to say you cannot talk about HIV in the classroom. You cannot talk about how HIV is transmitted in the classroom. So they're very narrow in many ways. They have been interpreted to be more broad, but they really came through that. And actually over the last 6 years, leading up to about 2020, we saw a decline in the number of these laws through great litigation from our partners at NCLR and actually some states repealing legislation. But then the pandemic happened. And what we saw was a resurgence of curriculum censorship bills, where now we have this landscape. And the new laws are much broader, right? They say you can't talk about sexuality, can't talk about gender identity, you can't talk about topics that make students uncomfortable. And these have been interpreted to include, right, discussions about race or slavery or the Holocaust. And so I think we really have to be thinking how these laws really are censoring what can be talked about in schools. The good news is we also have these states in green, and this is where we are also seeing some great progress. States that are saying, no, it is important to have inclusive curriculum, that our students should learn about the diversity of the communities in which they live and our country's history. And so we're sort of seeing a pulling in directions to the poles around this. Another area, obviously, that we are seeing a lot happening is around sports. So in 2020, there were no states that through statute banned trans students from playing on sports teams. There were always state athletic associations that had policies, but they were able to make changes to that. But state legislatures got involved. The first state was Utah. So this was in 2021. This is where we are now. So this has been an immensely quick moving policy area in the states when it comes to how trans kids, and we're talking about middle schoolers, right, playing on a volleyball team with their friends. Seeing where states are regulating how trans kids can participate in school sports. Bathrooms, right? I'm sure many of us remember 2016 and North Carolina and an effort to restrict how trans people can use the restroom. Up until a year or two ago, we didn't have any states that had laws restricting how trans kids could use restrooms. It often fell to districts. It often fell to maybe state boards of education and the policies that they would put into place. If we fast forward to now, every state that has a color on this map impacts K through 12 schools, right? And then we have some states that have gone beyond just schools to government-owned buildings or to college places. And these are not just restrooms. I think it's important to note. Obviously, restrooms are the thing that everyone uses every day, but we're also talking about changing rooms. We're talking about locker rooms. And when you think about students, both in school, how many times in a day do they need to go to the bathroom? And what does it mean? And there's research that trans kids may not drink anything all day because they don't want to have to go to the bathroom or they are afraid. So this is very tangible. And I can just imagine as an adult what that would be like at 12 to think about, what if I have to go to the bathroom and what am I going to do? Another area that we're seeing a lot happening is these kind of forced outing bills. And this really has come out of, I would say, the pandemic and parental fears around what's happening in schools. But we have had several states, you can see them shaded here, that have started to require that if a child discloses that they are questioning their gender identity or their sexual orientation, or they would like to use a different pronoun at school, that school officials must notify parents. And I think, there may be some of these exceptions for the safety of the child, but I think most of us can admit that, when we were first maybe thinking about coming out, you found that one trusted person, right? Before you maybe told your friends or you told your parents. And you may not have worried what your parents would do to you, but you weren't quite ready. And so now in these states, we have kids who don't know who to talk to at school, whether it's the counselor or the favorite teacher, right? So it's creating, again, this climate in which students feel like they can't share anything about their lives out of fear of what might happen. So these are some of the kind of innovations that we're seeing, rural innovations that we're seeing across the country. But I think what's important, right, you saw California green and then beige, right? So the landscape here in California at the state level, it's very positive. California ranks among the top states in the country, both on LGBTQ youth policies, but also across the board in the more than 50 policies that we track. But you're going to hear some conversation about some of these topics that I mentioned at the state level that are happening in other places. So I'll stop here. Pass it back to Christy.
Thanks, Naomi. So that's a great segue, because Amanda, your work at the ACLU is focused on what's happening here in California. And I'm sure many people in the audience have heard from Naomi and even outside of this conversation about the legislature's great strides in protecting LGBTQ students here at the state level. But we also know that those successes have been undermined by local efforts as well as even state ballot initiatives that really seek to undermine the rights of LGBTQ students. So Amanda, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what's going on in California, help make sense of this patchwork of protections across the state.
Happy to. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to the Williams Institute, not only for having me, but for hosting this conversation and this excellent conference every year. And Naomi actually sort of laid the foundation for, I think, every single thing I'm going to say about what we're experiencing in California, where in many ways it's the best of times and the best of places for LGBTQ youth, but there are also things going on that are the worst. So, talking first about what's good and what's strong, and that would be the law on paper is really excellent on a lot of issues relevant to LGBTQ students. We have enumerated protections in the education code. Schools cannot discriminate based on gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation, just like Naomi said. That has been true for about 20 years now. It's also illegal to harass anyone on those bases or to bully anyone on those bases. And about 15 years ago, that was enhanced by Seth's law, which puts an affirmative legal obligation on school staff to intervene if they witness bullying. And that is really important in terms of making it actually illegal to ignore these situations when they inevitably do happen. We also have very strong inclusive curriculum requirements. All California public schools have to include LGBT people among other diverse communities in the social studies curriculum at all grade levels. That was called the FAIR Act, and it took effect in 2012. And then on a different note, the sex ed curriculum has to be LGBT inclusive. And that includes not only the sex part, but just going over the concepts of gender identity, gender expression, sex orientation, and the fact that there is diversity of all those things in our world and in our community. Having those messages get out to all students, not just the ones who are identifying as LGBTQ, is huge. And I think that's part of why it has felt like a big advance to get those laws, but also why this is one of the areas where we see and experience the most backlash. Then there's facilities and activities, that's what the statute says, but we're talking about, as Naomi already brought up, restrooms and sports. And AB 1266 of 2013 was the law that addressed this across the board in California public schools, making very explicitly clear that all students have the right to access those things based on their gender identity, regardless of what their formal documentation says. It was controversial at the time. There was some backlash, there was some resistance in certain local communities. There was even an effort to go to the ballot and repeal it, but those things didn't work and the sky didn't fall. And I think that is actually really important as we look at the landscape of policy and what students experience in California. The fact that all of this has been in effect for over 10 years makes it more difficult, I'm not going to say impossible, but more difficult for anyone who actually cares about the well-being and learning of students to try to roll it back. But this is what we have, and it's the status quo, and it's working. However, not everything is sunshine and roses. For everything I just described, implementation has sometimes lagged behind what the law on paper says. I think that's especially true around the curricular stuff, where some districts have dragged their feet on fully implementing the social studies mandates, and in some cases also the sex ed mandates. And then there are school boards that are problematic. And there are parts of the state where in the past couple of years, things have started to swing back toward worse on these issues. The photo is from a board meeting at the Chino Valley Unified School District. That's one of our locally notorious ones out in San Bernardino County. But there are quite a few that are problematic. And like someone on the last panel said, I'm here representing a nonpartisan nonprofit, and I can't really get into a full political analysis of why this might be. But where school boards are problematic and they are explicitly targeting vulnerable groups and making a specific kind of parental rights argument that really crowds out the perspectives of a lot of the parents in the community about what would be best for their kids, we have problems. One of the big problems we're having is around forced outing. Again, Naomi already brought up this issue. Forced outing policies that target students who appear to be questioning or exploring their gender at school are super problematic for two main reasons. One is coming out as an extremely personal decision and everyone needs and deserves to do it at their own pace. The other is safety issues, as also mentioned, and it just doesn't work to impose this. In an ideal world, all young people would be discussing their gender struggles or whatever life things they might be going through with their families. And when young people haven't chosen to initiate that conversation already, there is often a good reason for it. And so we've seen a lot going on this issue. At least 8 school districts have passed forced outing policies. There has been litigation against some of them. Chino Valley's policy was enjoined and then changed. At the same time, there have been other bad policies that have passed in a few places, like book bans and other attempts to crack down on inclusive curriculum and library materials, as well as flag bans and efforts to get rainbow insignia and other evidence of this being a safe space out of the schools. I think that's a really awful message to send to young people, but it has gotten traction in a few parts of the state. And then in addition to those policies that are explicitly targeting LGBTQ content and people, we're starting to see some that don't say so explicitly. Like maybe it's not a ban on rainbow flags, but it's a ban on anything but the American and California flags on school property. Maybe it's not a parental notification requirement specifically about gender, but it's about any student accessing the school's counseling services. Those are really insidious and dangerous for LGBTQ students who are impacted. First of all, I think in many of these communities where these controversies break out, everyone knows what they're going after. And so the sort of reputational harm and chilling effect and students not feeling safe expressing themselves at school is still present. But they're also more difficult to challenge legally when they're not as explicit. So this is a problem we are contending with. At the same time, we are so privileged in California that a lot of the folks in leadership, including in the state legislature and in the executive branch of the state government, really want to make it better for LGBTQ youth. And frankly, a lot of our work on these matters at the ACLU these days consists of trying to help legislators and other policymakers whose hearts are in the right place and who want to do something supportive, figure out how to do it in a way that would be effective and constitutional. A few examples of things that have passed just in the past year or so that illustrate how progressive we are able to be in California. A bill from last year created the PRISM teacher training program, which will be, as a pilot, mandatory for all educators in grades 7 through 12. That is about LGBTQ inclusivity and providing support for whatever diverse constituency of students may be present. And we know that none of these other policies are very meaningful if the school staff who are supposed to be enforcing them don't understand the issues and what it looks like to be supportive. So having this required across the board for all educators and not just something that folks can opt into and it ends up being sort of preaching to the choir, this is a big step forward. And we had AB 1078 coming from Dr. Corey Jackson in the Assembly, who was concerned about both the trend toward book bans of an anti-LGBTQ nature, but also some of the efforts to crack down on critical race theory, which is absurd. What's happening in our public schools at the K-12 level is never critical race theory, but any discussion of racial diversity is causing some folks anxiety and they're trying to eliminate it. So AB 1078 addresses that by making it more difficult to remove materials from school libraries or curriculum and getting the state more involved in oversight of what local districts are doing. Among other things, it makes it possible if a district is not fulfilling its obligations to provide comprehensive curriculum, the state can intervene, order the proper textbooks, and bill that district. And finally, there was a bill coming out of the Senate last year about gender neutral school restrooms. We've had those lovely protections on the books for 10 years that make clear all students can access the facility that best matches their gender identity. But in most schools, there's only been boys' rooms and girls' rooms, and there is no facility that matches your identity if you're non-binary. As of 2026, that will change, and schools will have to provide that other facility option, and that is huge. Finally, we occasionally have to deal with macro threats, and part of that is about California not being immune to the broader political landscape on the national and international stage. We've seen just a few attempts in the state legislature to do negative anti-LGBTQ things. Fortunately, they have not gone anywhere. We've also seen over the past few months a proposal to put on California's ballot what we sometimes call the hate slate of 3 different anti-LGBTQ youth policies. This measure would ban gender-affirming healthcare for those under 18 in California, mandate forced outing in every school district in the state, and reverse AB 1266 as to bathrooms and sports and other activities and facilities. So not just repeal it, because in the pre-2014 era, many school districts, including LAUSD, already had good policies on the books about honoring students' identities, letting trans students use the proper restrooms, and so forth. If this passed, it would be a 180 from requiring all school districts to do the right thing by their trans students and would require all districts to do the wrong thing by their trans students. So it is harrowing and awful that this is proposed in California. On the other hand, they needed to gather over 500,000 signatures to get it on the ballot and are not on track to do so. So cautiously optimistic about where that is headed. And finally, for everything I've been talking about, it's only meaningful if it's implemented and enforced. And there have always been issues about how consistently that was happening and whether the California Department of Ed had enough staff to address things where districts are supposed to be accountable to the state. With the state budget tightening, that issue is getting worse. And I'm concerned about how real some of these protections are going to be in an era when there just aren't enough people paying attention. And I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Linda. So Reverend Ramsey, I want to ask you next. So at the Rainbow Pride Youth Alliance, you're directly serving and supporting LGBTQ youth in the Inland Empire. So I was wondering if you could tell us about how this political and legal landscape that Amanda and Naomi have outlined actually affects your clients in their day-to-day lives. And how do you support them in that? And then how are they also showing resilience in dealing with what's going on?
Well, as you can imagine, just by listening to what has Naomi and Amanda has shared, I mean, they're afraid, right? They're, feeling like their life and their ability to live authentically is in danger. They feel like the dumpster is on fire and that what is there to look forward to in their life. So they're expressing fear. They're expressing lack of safety. Who do I trust at my school to with my story, with my journey? And that's for kids who are out and those who are still figuring it out, right? But they have each other, right? And they still trust each other. But it's a very chilling time for young people, the young people that we serve. We're in a different school every day of the week. Providing services through the GSA, which are the gay straight alliances on most of the campuses. Some of them have very different names. And that's been the main conduit by which we've been able to reach young people if the school is not open to us being present in other ways. Another way has been through the wellness centers on the campus, which is now a new way that folks are attacking. The schools is saying, well, okay, let's go after the school wellness centers. But we're there. We have support groups virtually and in person, Tuesday through Friday for the ages 11 to 17, and then 18 and above, sometimes on the weekends, right? So we're providing some brave spaces for them to show up to, usually in public spaces like libraries, but we don't disclose where we are. But that way there's flexibility for them to be able to come up if they're not, sort of sharing all of their details with their parents. They can say, oh, I'm going to the library, right? And as a part of going to the library, they're getting access to some resources. The other side to that story is that they're finding ways to resist themselves. They say our very existence is our resistance, right? So they're showing up through art, poetry, dance, videos, arts and crafts to say, this is my story, this is my journey. Sometimes anonymous, sometimes very public. Other ways in which they've been showing up, they've been testifying at school board meetings, at city council meetings, wherever LGBT issues have been challenged, whether are the rights of young people, right? Because they're not alone. Their peers who are not LGBT are standing up. But then one very prominent thing that happened was there was a young person in Temecula who first started out just simply speaking at the school board meeting in Temecula and sort of talk in response to the flag banning, started distributing flags. All of a sudden, there was a nationwide surge of flags being donated to this young person so that they could distribute flags, rainbow flags, progress flags, any kind of flag that symbolized LGBTQ inclusion, so they could distribute those to anybody who wanted them. That was that young person's way of saying, you know what, you're not going to push us back into the closet. So those are some of the ways in which we're seeing the resilience of young people in the face of the challenges that come every day. It's also inspired us to be more vocal, to be more present, and to be more creative in the ways that we program with and for them. The other thing I wanted to point out make sure that I cover everything. Oh, one significant thing that recent, which is youth driven, youth led, you may see it in the media, you may see it on a billboard, is the Never a Bother campaign. It is a suicide prevention campaign launched throughout the state of California, not just in response to the challenges to LGBTQ youth, but to the challenges that youth are facing in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which many of them experience social isolation, and they still have not found their way back socially to connect with other people. And so this is just a constant reminder that whatever you're going through, whatever challenges that you face, whatever difficulties you find yourself in, you are never a bother to an adult in your life, never a bother to someone who will stand up for you. So if you have a need, please feel free to express that. And so this was a youth-driven project. Youth had input all across the state into what the message is and the messaging. So it just launched last week. So look out for those kind of representations. There are other projects that are coming along that are youth-centered, youth-led. The youth are going to be expressing their voices more prominently. And what they need from you is just a reminder all the time that you're okay, just as you are.
Thank you so much for that. And Kevin, I want to turn to you. So the UCLA LGBTQ Resource Center supports LGBTQ students and other folks on campus. And so, we've done some research on the issues facing LGBTQ students in higher ed, but I was wondering if you can talk about what's going on here at home with students and how campuses can do a better job at supporting their LGBTQ students.
Great, thanks so much. I'm honored to be on this panel with such amazingly fantastic people. I think it's so important to think about when students get here, they have already overcome so much to get here. The hurdles that LGBTQ students face are numerous, as described in law, in policy, on the ground, in schools, in their homes, in their communities, and their churches. And when students come to higher education, they are seeking a safe haven. They have probably dreamed of that moment, that they would walk on campus, that they would be out away from their families, and they could finally actualize into who they are. There's a unique precarity and promise that LGBTQ students face. And there is also, at times, a unfortunate adjustment to injustice. I did my dissertation really exploring gendered and sexual harassment as it faces, all people, all genders, and particularly focusing on sexual minorities. And there is this amazing set of research by Jennifer Frade and colleagues called institutional betrayal trauma. It's where in institutions that we rely on to live, learn, work, play, worship, we have this intense dependency upon them. And so either through acts of omission or commission of what should be done rightly, we maintain sometimes an inattention to the ways in which we are being mistreated. We may not even fully realize the ways in which we are mistreated, and oftentimes that turns to self-blame, self-harm, and maladaptive behaviors. On top of that, LGBTQ students right now are coming out of the pandemic turned endemic, where many of them were forced back into unsafe, unhealthy conditions in their family homes, where they were not allowed full authentic expression. They had limited abilities to develop social emotional learning. They clustered together online with like-minded people, but therefore also maybe didn't get certain skill sets around learning to work across difference and have people with different opinions as well. And they are highly connected through the internet, which is great. that also means they're exposed to so much trauma. And not just that faces our own community, but across the world. And, you know, LGBTQ students are not a monolith. LGBTQ students should be absolutely at the center of every single action of higher education institutions, because we exist in every community, in every pocket of the world, in every issue, and we have unique needs. And when you center the margins of the multiply marginalized, a rising tide lifts all boats. And so here at UCLA, I am lucky to be a part of an amazing legacy of an LGBTQ center that's been around for 25 years. The first LGBTQ staff faculty gathering was in secret 38 years ago in a living room. Don't tell anyone. I met the woman, she's a continued donor who hosted that. We focus so much on students, but we don't really think a lot about systems. And in order to serve students, we need to have healthy systems as a whole, and higher education that requires us to be having healthy relations amongst staff and important employee resource groups to support and gather resources. We need to be engaged with our community, not only in terms of serving the community, but what wealth does the community also have in exchange to offer our students? These students oftentimes do not have access to social networks of people like them. They don't know how to get jobs and navigate outing, or how to present themselves, or how to make visible something in ways that won't add to their stigma. And so I think we really need to think really holistically. So here at UCLA, there's a lot of great things happening. We have our Gender Recognition Act, right, where it's about changing data systems, and data systems affects housing, it affects student records, affects general gender and sexuality affirming, mental health care, it affects everything. You have to start with data, right? But as has been already expressed, how do you implement that? And I think it's important to think about history. This isn't really just about LGBTQ, right? We can think about how higher education itself has shifted over time. If you look at old buildings, the bathrooms used to be all for men. They've done this before for like 50% of the population. So this is actually a much smaller ask. So where's the money? If you're going to pass a policy, then you need to fund the implementation of that. And you need to provide accountability, not just top down, but from the bottom up. You need to be in relationship with students, empowering them, because they actually have the vision, the understanding, and the courage where we fail, right? And so part of the institutional betrayal literature also talks about institutional courage, right? And it's specifically thinking about sexual harassment, but I think we can broaden it, not to these capital T traumas only, but to these larger systems of injustice. My own research was looking at how we develop estrangement, both dependency from and alienation from institutions we rely on. And we see that happening right now in our very democracy. And higher education is meant to strengthen our democracy. And if we are not building important gender relational, inclusive, intersectional, sexual assault, harassment prevention, co-curricular development, community building, and really thinking about having like centering social emotional learning, and centering that every student has gender, every student has sexuality, every student has relationships. And if we started there, I'm so happy to see some of these bills that have happened in California. I don't know, I would have been in a much different place had I had those protections. But I think we really need to think more about not only these checkbox things, like gender inclusive housing is really important, you know, but we have that here, and I still have a student coming in saying, I'm afraid I can't just put non-binary, I need someone that is like me, that is stealth non-binary, because my parents were really discriminatory against my older sibling, and I'm afraid they're gonna throw me out. How do we support that student? So that's not just a policy thing. That means we need wraparound care. And these students need the most wraparound care, but not only them, undocumented students, students with mental health issues, students that are food insecure. And this disproportionately happens among the LGBT community, as seen in previous panels. And so I think when we both center the specific unique needs of this population, but not reduce them to victims. Think about them as wells of knowledge and experience and courage that can inform how we can best serve the whole population. I think that's how higher education institutions will thrive.
Great, thank you, Kevin. So I have a few discussion questions, but I wanted to see first if the audience had any questions for our panelists. Let's go here and then back there, start up front.
So this particularly pertains to UCLA. So back in December, a queer student was shot in the face with a BB gun, and called a slur. And I was just wondering if there was any updates, especially as the acting director, that you have on that, because as students, we don't have any updates. And of course, that leads to a lot of fear for queer students here. And I would say, yeah, there's just this culture right now in the community of not feeling safe and feeling just like we can't go anywhere on campus.
Thank you so much for that question. And for those that are listening online, the question was about a hate crime incident, which there was a clarity report about, where it was reported that a student was shot in the face with a BB gun and called a homophobic or anti-LGBTQ was a clear slur. And that was all that happened on an institutional level in terms of what was prevented. I have been talking to a lot of people to better understand, and there are things that I cannot share specifically around this because there are legal issues at play. There are disciplinary issues at play that I am not at liberty to speak to. They were hearsay anyways, so I don't have any official statement. I'm aware that there was that the justice system has been involved and that there is that is not an ongoing threat. I can share that. I think this points to a really important thing though, and we can think about this from this particular incident to other issues roiling our college campuses right now. We do have a lot of important, and policy has done this, how do we mitigate threats, after horrible school shootings. There was behavioral intervention teams and case management. We have thinking about what about people that have been victimized, right? And we go to support them. But what about when communities collectively experience trauma? And how do we respond to that? How are we responsive and proactive and not reactive, but really creating space, safe havens and spaces to process emotionally, to come back into community, to repair, to build trust. And it's hard. It's on a very highly decentralized campus. It's very difficult, but I think it's an important point that higher education institutions really need to think about, again, from student experience, right? Like, how do we bring to bear all of this? We have massive amounts of resources, right? We have CAPS, we have this, and we have that, and all these. So when there is an issue, either locally or perhaps globally, that is directly impacting certain communities, how are we then proactively creating spaces for healing and coming together? And especially if there's ongoing safety issues, regardless of not being able to answer specific issues around this case, there should be proactive ways of addressing already traumatized communities that are dealing with an acute, ongoing potential threats. But I can say that in this specific incident, there's not an ongoing threat. And I wish that at the state level, there were policies in place that would go beyond just the clarity reports and thinking about really supporting the needs of the community in the aftermath of that, whether it's around a hate crime or around a string of stranger sexual assaults that are happening, which I've experienced at another university I was at. There people are left to live with fear, and it's not fair. So thank you for the question.
I'm sorry, what do you mean by there's not an ongoing threat? I mean, I'm sorry to push back, but I kind of have to.
Yeah,
What does that mean?
I would say that in this case, the person found to be responsible has been involved into the justice system.
Okay, that's,
some
so that's
level.
one person.
The assailants
Okay,
involved have been addressed. And that's, I was not at liberty to share that, but as press, I suppose I must respond.
no, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, right here.
Just a comment on the conversation that we're having. If we want to protect trans children in school from parents who would be abusive, who don't understand trans, are we aware that the positions that we take in that conversation could turn around and bite us and, you know, and we're talking about a situation like PFLAG versus Abbott, where the same considerations are now going to work against us. We're talking about protecting parents who are supportive and who want to see their children, their trans children, receive appropriate pre-pubertal care. So and we get into this mess because we're not clear about what we're trying to do. We're not trying to impose a trans agenda on people who are not trans friendly. We're trying to protect trans children from being bullied, from being beat up now and in the future, which requires educating ordinary kids towards the rights of trans children. I'm just afraid that what I see is that everything is so muddled. We invoke intersectionality and into our conversation. And what are we doing? We are now empowering people whose ideology is intrinsically destructive to what we are trying to accomplish in the name of intersectionality, and it makes no sense. So I guess I'm calling for a different approach to specify, to be much more clear about what we're trying to accomplish and what we're not trying to accomplish, but which we're not really doing. Am I getting across? Do you understand the point? So just calling for clarity in our own language. Stop talking about man and woman, talking about male and female. Things like that can help advance the conversation and get us to where we want.
Thank you for sharing that. Anyone?
I'm gonna kind of sort of take your question at the leaping off spot, which is, I think the conversation around parental rights is a really interesting one, and I think you bring up, you know, the ways in which we can talk about the rights of parents of trans kids and the way that they should be able to get the care for their children that their children need, but also the way in which parental rights is being used against vulnerable children in our community. And so I think we really need to be careful, and I appreciate you raising that at the first part of your question about how do we do that thoughtfully. In the work that we do at Movement Against Project, we think a lot about kind of where people are, and I think we have to recognize the impacts of the pandemic, not just on the youth, but on parents and the kind of precariousness that many parents felt. And the other side is using that to fuel this piece. And I think it's actually deep parental concern that we can actually harness in good ways. That I think the majority of people in this country do care deeply about children, and they care deeply about trans children. They just don't know what it means to care deeply. And that is where we can say what it means is to have books in the classroom that reflect gender diversity. What it means is to make sure that kids can talk to social workers who care and love them. That it means that pediatricians can help families navigate complicated situations on a child by child basis. And I think we can kind of pull into that direction. That's what I see as a potential way to sort of thread all of these issues you're bringing together and actually help us center, I think as you mentioned, like really centering like who is vulnerable in our country and certainly in the LGBTQ community.
Thank you, Naomi. 2 more questions. Lindsay, I think you're first, then we'll go here.
This is for Naomi, but also, everyone. Obviously, we've been seeing massive increase in this kind of legislation, and we've also seen Republicans use it as kind of a wedge issue to move on to targeting adults, which has been very fun. And I was really interested in hearing about some of the kind of more sneaky ways that this legislation has been used to target trans youth. So I guess my question is, because we've been seeing kind of like new types of this legislation, we kind of start with sports and then you kind of put it back into other types. Do you think at some point we're gonna hit a ceiling where we kind of have seen the extent of the ammo type of legislation that they've got, and we'll kind of start to see a decline after these states kind of just pass the legislation they're gonna pass, or do you kind of just see this as kind of continuing to ramp up, like we haven't seen anywhere near as bad as it's gonna get?
I can start. I actually wonder, Amanda, if you can jump in a little bit, but I think, part of what we're seeing is that we may be hitting the limit in sort of people's willingness to go along. And I think around book bans, for example, we've actually seen, Moms for Liberty and other groups not succeeding in some other states, right? That they just have pushed so far, and actually people's affection for libraries and librarians and the ability to walk into the library and get a book that you love, right? That we may be hitting what people are willing to go with. I do think, right, the fact that many people still don't know someone who is trans, many people certainly don't know a trans child, I think is the question mark, right? Of it is easy to exploit fear of things that people don't know and understand. And so how do we, because they will continue to innovate, and I think as we think about after November, what that could look like, I think we have to be creative, but I don't know if you see something similar here in California.
I think it's a really good question. I think there is a legal process or conversation and a political process and conversation, and they inform one another and kind of intertwine. There have been some promising signs on the political front lately in terms of the antis going too far, and credit to some Orange County colleagues in the room, there's been some progress on recalling some of those awful school board members who were causing the problem in some of our local communities. I think that is helpful in possibly taking the heat off trans youth as a target in areas where it just doesn't seem to be politically working past a certain point. At the same time, as horrific policies pass around the country and many of them get challenged, some of those challenges have been successful, some of them have not. And that's largely a product of Trump appointed judges. And so, I don't want to get into talking about the dark times that could be ahead of us, but I think the last panel focusing on the importance of voting is exactly right. And that there's a world in which it's easier for things to get worse if there appears to be no chance of legal accountability for making them worse. And we're in a little bit of a time of uncertainty. I don't think it's ever healthy to rely on the courts as our main pathway to liberation, but right now that would be a really bad idea.
Thank you. So I see that we only have a minute left, and I do want to end on a happy note. So I was hoping that we could go across the panel and each of you could just tell us what LGBTQ joy means to you, for yourself, your families, the youth you work with, the youth you hear about in the news. Share something that you think embodies LGBTQ joy. Naomi, let's start with you.
I mean, I can say when I started at Williams in 2008, it was a very different landscape, and we were in a very similar time. Prop 8 passed 3 months after I started working at Williams, and so I think just knowing the ebbs and flows of where we can go is what gives me optimism and joy.
What gives me joy is seeing the courage of young people as they challenge systems and force us to really reckon with ourselves. And I also find moments of resistance by just coming back into my body, dancing, moving, being in nature, and understanding that that too is queer.
I think finding community and ultimately chosen family is really important. And I think that even in the worst of times and the worst of places within our current moment, that is so much easier on balance for young people to do than it was when I was a queer teenager in Virginia in the early 90s and barely had NOL access. And I think watching young people, including when I was on the board of GSA Network, meeting some fantastic youth organizers and even folks in my personal life who come out later in life, that ability to find one another and form community is critical.
Amazing. Yeah, and just what came to mind for me, I was just thinking about this conference we had a couple weeks ago, and it's the drag realness that came into the room and just how young people responded to that, and they were all up on their feet, dancing and singing and moving, and for a moment they forgot any problem, any care. And so having those spaces and those opportunities for them to express themselves, to imagine what tomorrow can be, brings me great joy.
Thank you so much to all of the panelists.